Welcome to the Critical Few Actions to Improve Your Business podcast. I'm John Downs and I'm here to help you cut through the overwhelm and prioritise what matters most to improve your business. Let's get started and discover the critical few actions that have the biggest impact. Today, I'm talking with Jayston Small. I met Jayston 3 years ago in my CEO Masterclass in Strategic Planning and Implementation. And Jayston has got a team of about 50 people preventing and putting out fires on offshore oil rigs and chemical plants. He's recognised as a specialist in risk and recovery management with extensive experience in the energy sector. He's worked with global organisations and led teams on offshore and onshore projects throughout Europe, Asia Pacific, and he specialises in risk management. Jayston, welcome.
Thanks, John. Nice to be here.
So, Jayston, we were having a chat the other day about a distillery in regional Australia, and it really stuck in my mind. I was wondering if you could just tell me a bit more about it, because it really frames up a really important case study.
Yeah, well, as many of people who are listening will know, distilling has gone bananas in Australia. It used to be a very small cottage industry, and now there's hundreds of distillers throughout the entire country. And it's quite an immature industry with risks which are being learnt about as people go about their business. And so it's an interesting, industry to talk about with regards to risk, because people don't necessarily fully yet understand what they're being exposed to. And yet everyone's faced with the same risks. So there's a great opportunity to share throughout that industry.
This explosion in the gin industry is a really good example. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, you could walk into a bottle shop and you'd have a choice of about 4 or 5 gins, and that was pretty well it. Roll forward 7 years, you walk into a bottle shop and you've got a choice of 100. And there are over 100 distillers of gin in Australia, and there's other fortified wines, brandies and others that are actually now being bubbled up. So that must create, just by its nature, a reasonable level of exposure that we're not familiar with, but also a fair amount of commonality. And I don't know if people are talking to each other. What are your thoughts?
Certainly the peak bodies in the various states are doing a good job at sharing tools and ways to mitigate risk. But it's very much focused on just health and safety, which is obviously incredibly important. But there's also other risks that these distilleries are facing. They're inviting members of the public in to see what's going on. There's the usual small business, medium-sized business risks that they're faced. And being such an immature industry, everyone's learning on the feet. And, there's a chance somebody's going to get caught out, which nobody wants.
So you were saying that you'd been working with a distiller, and they had a number of real challenges that they were trying to get on top of from a compliance perspective and a safety perspective. Can you tell me a bit more about how that sort of presented itself?
I was actually just doing a personal visit to a distillery in regional Australia and took an interest and noticed that, because obviously I'm deeply knowledgeable of health and safety, I was noticing things that really shouldn't be going on in a distillery. We got flammable substances. Members of the public were able to walk straight by them. I noticed the things like the bond store was not secure from a security perspective, this was a whiskey distillery, and they had aged whiskey all stored in one place. So, it's very difficult with insurance to recreate 20-year-old whiskey. When it's gone, it's gone.
Right. Yeah. So when you had, obviously they got you involved in this process, what was driving their concern? Were they worried about their 20-year-old whiskey, or were they more concerned about business continuity? Or was it just simply a health and safety compliance issue?
No, this was a really progressive distillery. They wanted to do better and they wanted to learn. And in your intro, you kindly said I put out fires. Fortunately, we're in the business of preventing fires. And so the leadership of this distillery was great, because they said, well, how can we learn from other industries? Not just health and safety. They're interested in reputation management. They're interested in cash flow management. So we did our all hazards, all risks assessment with them to really unpick that business. And what was interesting was they obviously have colleagues throughout the industry, and the level of knowledge was not where it needed to be. But what was really encouraging was that everybody wanted to find out more and learn from oil and gas, learn from mining, and learn from, chemical plants. What are the tools that we could use and then right size them for a distillery? Because many of these distilleries are 2 or 3 people. It's not a large workforce. So bringing in pages and pages of documentation isn't appropriate, but there are certainly things that they can do to improve risk management on site and keep it under control year after year after year. It's never I talk about people getting risk fit. It's like you go to the gym. If you stop going to the gym, you don't remain fit. And the same with risk management. You've got to get yourself fit and stay fit. And most of that is being constantly vigilant to the changing workplace and the changing economic environment in Australia, which at the moment, as we know, is very up and down.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you talk about an all hazards, all risks assessment, I mean, that sounds like a sort of a really belt and braces process. But when you've got a workforce of 2 to 3 permanents and a couple of casuals on a seasonal basis, what does that start to look like?
Well, look, it can be bigger than Ben-Hur. So we try and focus on the high consequence events, the things that can destroy your business, hurt people, hurt members of the public, the stuff that really matters. Ideally, you'll deal with everything, but in a practical sense, focus on the stuff that can either destroy your business or hurt people or damage the environment or your reputation is where you start. And over time, you can bring in the lower medium risk.
Sounds like the critical fear to me. So
it is same principle.
So when you're looking at a small or even a medium sized business like that, what do you commonly see as being the big hitters?
Cash flow is always number one.
Okay,
and it's remarkable.
Start talking about flammables. So tell me a bit more about your top 3. That's interesting.
Well, cash flow is normally the one that's not done well. It's remarkable the number of small businesses do not have a cash flow forecast, even something rudimentary. And I understand. I mean, I founded a business with 2 colleagues 25 years ago, and we were still trying to work out where the revenue comes from. So it's completely understandable. But as businesses grow, getting cash and understanding cash is the most important thing outside of health and safety. Because of course, keeping people safe is always number one.
Yeah, that's everything. But that should be our starting point. So, okay, so the big hitters start with cash flow, obviously after health and safety. What do you then start to see as the most common ones from a SME perspective?
Then we jump in, unfortunately, into the compliance space. And, it's often known as a tick and flick. And there are businesses out there that just want to be compliant and then get back to doing what they think is more important, which is, disappointing because compliance is really just table stakes. You do it and then you should look to do better.
I mean, the reality is regulatory environments, really, they set the minimum bar, not the maximum bar.
That's right. And you when you work with a business, you can tell the ones that you really want to work with are the ones that are doing the things they should be doing when nobody's watching and nobody would find out. It's back in the old days with safety glasses and hard hats. We used to have to police people and tell them to wear them. And unfortunately, we got into the hearts and minds and we managed to get the message across that actually it was in their interest to look after their eyes and their hearing and their health because they could then provide for their families. And then you find people doing the right things to protect themselves, their workmates, and the place they work as just normal course of business. And it's the same with all other risks. It's getting through that these things are important. They'll maintain a healthy business, keep you a sustainable business. And even if it's a compliance issue or not, you should be doing them and pushing beyond compliance. Good compliance, good risk management is very, very good for business.
Yeah. And so, when you're thinking about a small distillery, how do you get them up to speed at a level that A, is going to help them be compliant, B, is going to help them be safe, but is also manageable for them? Because, I think one of the things that turns people off, things like risk management, risk assessment is that it seems to just be overwhelming. It seems to be, a documentation nightmare. There's not just 10 policies that need to be written, but potentially hundreds of documents that need to be prepared. And it's probably easier just to focus on the business and keep your head in the sand than it is to actually look at those things. So how do they get risk fit?
I guess the first principle is to work at the speed the business can cope with, because this is all additional work to start with. Eventually, it will help the business be more efficient, but it's important to really understand what speed can an organization work at. Is it going to take 2 years, 3 years? There is no rush. What's important is to understand your high consequence risk quickly, and that can be done in a day, because distilleries all face 80 to 90% the same risks, whether they're Irish, Scottish, Tasmanian, Victorian. The risks are very, very similar. So we're starting from a position of knowing 80% of probably what's going on. And then you can focus the 20% using the workforce, which is really important, the people that know about the workplace and the business, to identify those unusual different risks in the context of where that distillery is located. I mean, the environment of Tasmania is very different than Scotland, but distilling is distilling. So you're never starting with a blank sheet of paper.
If you really want to kick off your strategic planning and work in a supportive environment with other CEOs and leaders, the CEO Masterclass in Strategic Planning and Implementation is for you. This 10-month small group course helps you craft your strategic plan, present it to a group of peer investors, and develop a habit of monthly implementation. Our waitlist is open now at criticalfewactions.com.au. Yeah. Interesting. I remember that we were talking a while back also about, some of the heavy construction businesses and the manufacturing businesses. I'm thinking about a galvanizer as an example of what I would have thought would be a really high risk industry where you're dipping, I don't know, trailers, truck parts or construction materials into, hot liquids to coat them. And it doesn't matter whether it's galvanizing or whether it's a paint shop or, when you've got high temperature products or you've got hazardous chemicals, it's the similarities between that and distilleries are actually quite, they start to become quite obvious. But you have the same thing when you're actually building widgets, whether it be on a semiconductor processing line or whether it be manufacturing switchboards. How transportable is some of this stuff?
I wouldn't have any figures, but I would estimate at least 80% is transportable between all industries because people are involved, the environment's involved, business runs the same no matter what industry you're in. Most hazards and risks are present at every site. And, if you're prepared to accept that and stand on the shoulders of giants and what's been done before, enables you then just to focus on what's different at this work site. What chemicals are here? Do we have heat? Are we working at height? Do we have intellectual property risk? What are our neighbors doing? Maybe the biggest risk to our place is actually what's happening next door. Do we engage with our neighbors? Do we find out what's going on next door? Because maybe that's the biggest risk to your business. Nothing to do with you. Something you've got very little control over.
Yeah, actually, you just reminded me of the session we had down at the Geelong Incident Control Centre. It hadn't dawned on me, but it was painfully obvious that actually the neighbours were as big a contributor to your risk profile as any. I mean, we've seen in the last 5 years 2 major chemical company fires in the western suburbs of Melbourne with plumes of smoke. And sadly, that has actually resulted in some loss of life and also quite a bit of environmental damage. But more importantly, or as importantly, all of the businesses in the immediate kilometre surrounding area had to be evacuated. They all got shut down for a period of time, perhaps only a couple of hours, but potentially a couple of weeks, while buildings were made safe from being collapsed, fires were being put out, chemicals were being contained, the air was clearing and so on. I'm not sure that any of them would have thought that being, within half a kilometre of a chemical company was going to be an issue for them, but it could easily have been a rendering plant or it could easily have been something else. The fallout cloud is quite large.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate. One of the greatest challenges we have when we work with businesses to help them or tell them invest in being prepared and planning for an unplanned event. So we do all the work, identify risks, which, may be present on site, but that's really just 30% of it. The next step is to make sure you plan for and you're prepared for an event happening and be ready for it. Because if you're ready for it, the financial impact can be significantly less. If people know what to do, they've got plans, they've got procedures, which could be just a single sheet of paper. What are we going to do if we can't access a site because our neighbours had an issue with whatever may have gone on, but we can't use the road or we can't use our premises for 3 weeks? What's the plan? Is there a plan? And, if you look at the businesses that we've worked with who have a plan and prepared for it, and they've trained their people in it, and training can be 2 hours a quarter. It's not a huge amount of time. It's just doing a little something often, but the financial impact between those that are prepared and not prepared is hundreds of thousands of dollars, even for a small business.
Yeah.
And these are businesses that don't have the financial resources and the buffer to have that kind of money go out the business unplanned. It kills businesses.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So, when I think about that, I guess there's a couple of things sort of ratcheting through my mind. The first one is, okay, so there's a really high level of commonality, up around the 70-80% between businesses around the sorts of risks that they're going to be facing. And as a result of that, I suspect there's a level of commonality about how they actually address some of that. In preparing policies, documentation, and one pages, is that now all been solved simply by ChatGPT, or is there a little bit more to it than that?
Oh, look, I think AI's got a key role in all of our work lives now. And I think it's a great tool and we should all be using it, embracing it. But it's only a tool, it's only helpful. As you say, that there's a lot of commonality in hazards and risks. And there's also a lot of commonality in risk controls. The things you could do to reduce risks, things you could do to eliminate the risk from your business. You could even transfer risk out of your business through insurance. We all do that with our cars. We don't take on the risk of a car, we transfer it through insurance. So there's a great deal of commonality with controls. And we will present to people we work with, here's 50 things you could do. What would you like to do? Because the risk appetite and the tolerance, it remains with the company. We as supporting organization don't make those decisions. We make recommendations. We provide almost like a buffet of options. And often it's what can be afforded, what's reasonable, what's practical. And, that's very different for $1 billion business versus one that's turning over $100,000. Everything's got context, but there's a great deal of commonality. But the fundamental issue with controls is once they're in place, to keep making sure they're effective. And this is the biggest challenge every business has in Australia. And I know WorkSafe Victoria go on about it all the time, quite rightly. And that is, you've got controls, you believe your risk is reduced, but actually are these controls effective? And it's the one thing I'd say to anyone in this space, effective controls is where you should be focused.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more. Tell me a bit more about that. As a small business owner or a medium business owner, there's already, what I'm hearing is that, there's already an overwhelming number of areas that I can't even imagine of risks that I need to be aware of. I need to be able to come up with the critical few so that I can actually implement the mandatory, the deal breakers, the business killers, and hopefully not the people killers. I need to address those absolutely immediately. But to do that, I've got to actually have a plan and effective controls. So tell me a bit more about effective controls.
So effective controls are ones that you're actually doing, and ideally ones that do not require human intervention. For example, for my business, our biggest risk is driving. But none of us get in a car and think we're going to have a car crash that day. We're so familiar with it. Yet as a business, as you're sending people out in a car or a van or whatever you may be doing on the road, you're so reliant on human behavior, which is the least reliable. Yes, they're licensed drivers, might put them through driver training, might require them to drive in daylight hours only, not after a work day. Many things you could do, But all those controls at a small and medium business size require a human to make good choices and follow procedures. And so, your checking really results in, did you spot checks? Is that reasonable in a country the size of Australia to go out onto the roads and catch people doing the right thing? So, the biggest risk to our business, and you're requiring people to, do the right thing, which is a very Australian phrase, but it's what you're relying on here. Whereas things like cyber security risk, you might have two-factor authentication. You might have your IT provider do all the right patches to make sure your system's up to date, and you put your people through cyber training. But again, you've got a human there. You're relying on them, and they're the least reliable, unfortunately. I mean, people almost always try and do the right thing, but we're not perfect. We're human.
Yeah. I'm already visualizing Aidan, who was working for a client of mine in the northern suburbs, and he was a lovely chap, trying to do the right thing by his employer. Curiosity killed the cat. An email came into his inbox, as it did to all of them, and it had an enticing subject line. And despite the fact that he'd already opened the email from his general manager, which said, "If you receive this email, do not open it," the temptation was too much. And they actually ended up being, a victim of ransomware. And so, yes, humans can be quite unreliable. I mean, the reality is, I'm a great believer that virtually nobody goes to work wanting to do a shit job. But sometimes people can be inadvertently human. And we can't necessarily protect themselves or ourselves from that. And, that's the reality with so many workplace injuries, is that mainly it's human error. Our workplaces have become so much safer over the last sort of 30, 40 years. Human error is still something that we struggle to get around.
But on the flip side to that, something that we've made massive inroads in is looking out for each other. This whole culture now where at work, it's okay to speak up. It's okay to stop work and say, hang on, something doesn't feel right here. Let's just stop. There's different organizations use different language, be it step back 5 by 5 or take 5. And there's many other names for the same thing. But, before you start work, just, take 5 minutes, have a look around, step back from the workplace. What's changed? Is this how I thought it would be? And colleagues looking out for each other too, intervening. I mean, I walk down the street in Melbourne, and you see some unusual practices, and you wonder how it goes on in this day and age. But look, I can't solve world hunger. What I can do is look after the businesses I'm working with, and help them be self-sufficient. Because ultimately, the ultimate aim of a business like mine is you're not needed in 2 or 3 years. You've embedded the practices, and our goal is to actually leave a company and not have a long-term customer base. We want to get in, help, and get out because they don't need us anymore.
And you mentioned earlier on, the financial implications, and I guess we can imagine the financial impact of not being able to function for 2 or 3 days, or even 2 or 3 weeks, or if you're in Victoria, a couple of years during a global pandemic. We are largely to a degree on our own, except in the case of, a global issue where there isn't really a safety net. We've either got our insurance, or we've got our reserves of, 3 to 6 months of operating expenses, in that I hope I'll never need this rainy day account. But, thinking about the financial impacts, where do you see the key financial impacts coming from?
Well, the first thing I'd say is whatever you think it's going to cost, add a zero.
Right.
Because we're always hopelessly underestimate the impact. And the impact is extraordinarily more if you don't think in terms of recovery work while you're responding, while you're trying to keep your business operational. Now think about that for a small, medium-sized business. You've gone from running a business to now needing to keep your business going. You need a team focused on recovery, and you need a team focused on responding to what's just happened to you. That's a significant strain on your business. So you're pulling in resources from law firms, accounting firms, public affairs firms, and the bill gets extraordinarily large very quickly. And this is why you need to be prepared and plan for it. So you know what to do and keep your costs under control. And, if you have gone through the process and practice, you could then think about do I need to get myself some extra insurance to cover some things which would actually destroy my business? But you only get to experience this if you've gone through with your team a few drills or exercises and starting to think, how bad could this be? Because it gets pretty chaotic and information comes at you in an unplanned event and half of it is wrong. So you've got to pick through what's the right information. Most business leaders are used to making decisions with only 60% of the information we'd like to have. Now you'll be doing with 30 or 40% conflicting information and lots of emotions running high. These are people that are very, very good probably at running the business with you, but they're not experienced at, making critical decisions under time pressure. Because if you don't make decisions, time will make the decision for you, and it's unlikely to be the one you want.
Right. So let's double down on a couple of those things. So when we have a crisis, we've got 3 jobs instead of 1. One is operate the business as normal in an abnormal environment. Then you said the recovery actions that we need to do. And the third one was?
Responding to the incident.
Okay. So let's drop into both the recovery and the responding. So tell me about the recovery actions that we might be facing. Help me just visualize those.
So this is getting the business back to business as usual. So do we need to get some stock from somewhere else? Do we need to augment the staff? Once we've got through the initial 8 hours, 24 hours, 72 hours, and got things under control, we don't then want to start thinking about getting ourselves back on our feet. We want to start straight away. So we want a team visualizing, okay, when this chaos is gone, what do we need to do and start doing now to get the business back on its feet? And that's probably the most variable area of our work because, unplanned events are so dynamic, but you've kind of got to foresee and plan for. And, at times spend a lot of money just in case. I know that certainly the Hazelwood fires in Victoria, a lot of money was spent bringing in equipment and product just in case, or unfortunately it was needed, but only because somebody was thinking ahead did we have what we needed when we needed it.
Right. And the responding activities, what do they look like?
Oh, it could be dealing to social media outrage. It could be dealing to a security event with people outside. It could be dealing with next of kin, making sure the police have got those information. Or it could be dealing with the environment. You got to stop the spill into a waterway, regulatory reporting, the list goes on. And as you can see, unless you've got this written down and you know what to do, who to call, the time you've got to call them, who can help, who can hurt, it's really important if you think of your business, who can help us in a time of crisis and who's likely to hurt us.
There's absolutely no way that you can think about that on the spot. You would spend all of your time just trying to figure out what to think about, let alone actually dealing with the issues and the act.
And the great thing here is we spoke at the front, for most businesses, 80% of it's the same. You're not on your own. You're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. This is not a huge amount of work, but it is so vital if you need it.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a sec, but just coming back to the financial side of it. So our insurers, obviously they provide a whole variety of products and, those products are risk managed from their own perspective as to what they think the risk is going to be, what the likelihood of a claim is, because most insurers prefer that the money only goes in one direction, to them and not from them. Not that I'm bitter, but how do they assess the size of the risk that they're facing when Joe Schmo goes online and tries to get an insurance quote and a cover note to deal with their future business interruption? And how do they differentiate between the unsophisticated, the unknowing, or just innocent small to medium business versus one who's gone through a process of actually getting their risk fitness in order?
To be honest, I don't know how anyone can get insurance without really understanding your risks. I mean, the insurance you're getting, I would imagine, I don't have data, I would imagine you're paying a hefty premium. Because if you aren't able to write a good narrative about how your business runs, the risk is exposed to, and all the things you've done to reduce risk, which ultimately reduces the chance of an insurance company having to pay money back to you. Unless you've gone through that process, you'd have to be paying more because the insurance companies would be loading up premiums, I would imagine. I don't know, but I wouldn't have thought
They
they would
wouldn't have
say,
a
well, if you
choice.
don't know what risks are,
Yeah.
exactly. But if you go through a process and say, these are all the things we're exposed to, we understand them, we've treated them, we've eliminated the ones we can, and the rest are under control, and we're monitoring the controls for effectiveness over the long term and checking in with them, then you'd be, I'd imagine, would be a good risk for an insurer. But also, you now know what type of insurance you want. You're not going blindly and getting management liability and cybersecurity and public and product liability insurance. You're clearly linking risks in your business to insurance, and there you're making a conscious decision to transfer risk out of your business with insurance.
Yeah.
You're tying the whole story together if you do risk first, insurance second.
Yeah. So you're actually making fully informed decisions. And whether the insurance premiums as a result are higher or lower is probably not a function of anything more than the fact that you're actually making a conscious decision about what risks and what risks you want to transfer to an insurer on a meaningful basis. I mean, it may well be that the insurance costs actually increase, but simply because you actually were completely clueless before as to what insurance you actually need and how much cover you needed. So that's not really a function of being gouged by the insurers. It's actually just simply that you were chronically underinsured anyway because you were clueless.
Yeah, appropriate insurance goes both ways, no question.
And so now coming to, we've got our response and our recovery actions, and we've got our business as usual actions. We've got 70 to 80% of risk management and risk identification is common across all businesses. And it still feels both that it can be overwhelming, but also that there is a vast amount of work that can be done. How can a small to medium enterprise, particularly a medium enterprise, short circuit this process? How can they distill it down and get fit? I mean, everyone wants to go to the gym and be buff before summer, usually 2 days before spring ends. So, how do you get risk fit in no time? What are my
step
critical
number
few,
one,
perhaps?
Critical few start off with risk appetite. A business has got to decide how much risk it's willing to take. Now, so far on this podcast, we've talked about almost the downside. Risk management also is really important with upside. If you're a whiskey distiller and you want to get into gin, you need risk management to make that, business growth journey effective. But once you've decided on your risk appetite, and it's different for every business. For example, some businesses, $10,000 is a rounding error on their balance sheet. To others, that's half their income in year one if they're a startup. So an environmental impact. If you're a real estate agent, your environmental impact is quite different than if you're a gold miner in regional Victoria. So once you've established risk appetite, it's worth investing a day, and it's only a day, with members of your workforce, experts, get the right people in the room, and really identify hazards and risks. And again, you're really just looking for the last 20%. And it's not cookie cutter. It sounds cookie cutter. It's not. It's saying what's been done before. Maybe you're the 100th distiller to go through this process. By being open to using what's gone before, it's not a workshop of 10 people giving their experience. It's really a virtual workshop of 1,000 people. Yeah. Vast amounts of knowledge, and you get a great outcome by being prepared to, stand on the shoulders of giants, as I said before. So really that's a day and a half with a risk appetite, thinking about that, soaking on it for a while, because I'm a firm believer in you make good decisions when you sleep, and then understand your hazard and risk, and then start working out which ones you need to deal with now. Because, Rome wasn't built in a day, but once you start on this journey and start embed the processes in your organization, you'll find you get quicker and quicker at dealing with things. But you just got to start with number one and number two. It's remarkable what you can get done in a year if you put your mind to it.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And more importantly, it sounds doable.
It is doable. It is entirely doable. And, some organizations take 3 years. Some take 6 weeks. Both are admirable just doing something and getting started.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
the workforce buy into it. When they see leadership of a business taking it seriously, they'll take it seriously, and you'll get the whole workforce behind you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess that overwhelm. One of the things I'm constantly concerned about is how do we reduce overwhelm for business owners, because there's so much to look at any point in time. Being able to actually distill that down and just focus on those critical few actions that are really essential does make it doable, does make it easier to do, particularly as we're trying to compartmentalize. So, Jayston, how does your organisation Riskfacta help with this process?
So Riskfacta was born out of the oil and gas industry. We've been working in that industry for over 2 decades. And as you'd imagine, there's some fairly significant risks to people, the environment, reputation. And, the oil and gas disasters around the world, we all know the names. They make movies out of them, unfortunately. That level of support is incredibly sophisticated. It's heavy on documentation, vast workforces, and that would just swamp the small and medium-sized business. So Riskfacta's democratizing all that experience. There's over 1,000 years of experience in the business, and we've democratized it by making fit for purpose, small, tailored, go at the pace you want to work, program and product, which enables businesses to learn from absolute giants of industry who have had some terrible lessons, and they've learned from them. And the lessons they've learned are really, really powerful. And being able to feed that into small and medium-sized businesses will make a difference, real difference to those workplaces.
Fantastic. Are you looking to pinpoint the areas that will make the biggest impact on your business? Check out the Organisation Performance and Value Diagnostic. This powerful tool lets you evaluate your business on multiple facets and provides email reminders to keep you on track. Head over to criticalfewactions.com.au and get started now. So, Jayston, there's been a substantial increase in people's awareness, understanding, and their commitment to dealing with ESG over the last 10 years. How does risk management impact governance and reporting to a board?
So, in my view, everybody is a risk manager in a business. Board members, CEOs, senior leaders, people on the shop floor, people stacking shelves, we're all risk managers. And a good culture in an organization, in my view, people see themselves as risk managers. But you can't swamp a board with all risks. They need to know what's material. And so it's really important for an organization, again, when we talk about focusing on high consequence risk and high risk, that you've got a way of communicating upwards in an organization. These are our high risks. These are our high consequence risks. They're under control. And this is the last time we checked, which gives board members the opportunity to do what they should be doing, and that's ask questions. Tell me more about that. We're going to do a deep dive into that particular risk this year, and we're going to make sure that everything is squeaky clean, because we're relying on the reports coming up. Our role is to challenge and ask questions, but you can't give them all hazards or risks. It'll swamp, and it misses the point of focus at a board level.
And they've got a fiduciary responsibility as directors of the organisation. They have both a fiduciary, a legal, and in some cases a criminal responsibility to oversight the management of those risks by the management team. So if anything, it's an essential part from a board perspective to know that risk is being assessed, managed, mitigated against as part of them doing their duty.
I found it very interesting when industrial manslaughter laws changed and, there's criminal actions potentially for directors and other office holders. I expected there to be quite a change in how particularly health and safety risk was reported and looked at, but I haven't yet seen a discernible difference on the ground. Even with significant change in consequence for directors, we haven't yet seen that flow through, which is a little bit disappointing, to be honest.
And do you think that's because of ignorance or because they felt they had it all under control anyway?
It's my old favorite, the optimism bias. We know bad stuff happens. We just don't think it will happen to us or happen here. And unfortunately, that is everywhere. But like I talked about earlier, jumping in a car, we know there are car crashes every day. People lose their lives every day on the roads, but we never believe it will be us.
Mm.
And the optimism bias is probably the biggest enemy of risk management.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So, Jayston, thank you. This has been enormously helpful because every day I deal with, and I'm privileged to work with, founders, CEOs, senior leadership teams to talk about their strategic planning, what their visions are for the future, how they plan to get there, what their implementation plan is. And obviously, I have this focus on helping reduce their overwhelm by just focusing in on those critical few actions that, if they did nothing else, would help them get towards their vision. You know, as you go through that process, there is always the uncovering of some of the significant risks that people are aware of. But as we've spoken today, I think what it also highlights is how many risks there are that people haven't thought about because they haven't had the opportunity to draw on their peers outside of their organisation, potentially outside of their industry, and certainly probably outside their experience. And so for them to be able to actually identify, understand, get a sense of the order of magnitude of the risk and the implications that they might need to put in place now to avoid those risks or mitigate the chances that human error or positive bias might bring those risks to their doorstep, I found really interesting. You know, the idea of that we've got to actually run 3 jobs as an organisation should a substantial event occur. That is, try keeping the business as usual running. Secondly, set up for our recovery really from the first hour or the first day for us to recover from the calamity. And then thirdly, to deal with the response actions. I think that really shows how important it is to have thought through some of these things before it happens, because there's not a chance in hell that we're going to be able to think about these issues and come up with intelligent decisions in the moment if we haven't thought about anything at all. So, Jayston, that's been, for me, really important, and I appreciate you taking us through it.
No, thank you for the opportunity, John. Nice to talk today.
Fantastic.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Few Actions podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and grab the downloadables from the show notes. And if you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you share it with your peers and your team. Stay focused and take action. The Critical Few Actions podcast, including show notes and links, provides general information only and is not individualised business advice, nor can it be relied upon as such. You must take responsibility for your own advice, decisions, and actions.